Last week, I started feeling like a cold was coming on. I tested negative then within 12 hours. I was really sick, and then tested positive. The first few days were like a blur, sleeping in and out all throughout the day. I self quarantined in my bedroom away from the rest of my family. I didn't leave my bedroom for almost 5 days. I don't know which night it was, but it was probably Sunday or Monday. I woke up to someone standing in my room. It first looked like a tall, thin person draped in black and with a hood on. But then I saw it was a woman standing there, all in black and with long hair. I sat there in shock, just sweating out so much that sweat was dripping from my chin and nose. I looked at her, and she just stood there. Her shape was almost giving off fumes, like there wasn't a fine line to her outline, if that makes sense. Attached to my master bedroom is my master bathroom, and inside there is a nightlight that turns on when motion detected. Well, that light triggered and turned on, so I turned to look at the bathroom doorway and the light. As soon as I turned back to look at the lady standing in my room, she was gone. Only a jacket hanging behind the door was there. I don't know how to explain it, but the jacket was there and has been there for weeks. But that wasn't the dark shape that I saw. The dark shape was closer, like toward the edge of the bed to me. Then all of a sudden, the motion light in the bathroom went off and I was sitting there in darkness. I reached around for the TV remote and turned the TV on, and then reached over and turned on my side table light, and stayed up until I guess I went to sleep again, which wasn't that long. It was all during my COVID times. I seemed to fall asleep a lot. Maybe it was the virus that made me see something, but I know what I saw, and I know that lights came on in the bathroom. I think had I not been so sick at the moment, I would have been more terrified. A little backstory. My wife's grandma died in April, not COVID related. My father-in-law got the house, and being 70 and alone, didn't want to move and live in the bigger house alone. So he basically gave it to my wife, I, and our twin girls. Here's a list of events and some logical explanations, if I have one. Just after Grams passed, my father-in-law was staying at the house to keep a presence there, so no one would think it was abandoned. He was working on a puzzle at the kitchen table, so he had a lamp on the table. When he went to bed, he left the lamp on. The next morning, the lamp was off, but the overhead light in the next room was on. This is the room where she passed, and that light was on the whole time she was in her last days. Explanation: father-in-law is 70 and had just lost his mother. Maybe he didn't remember switching the lights. We shut our door to our room when we shower, so we don't wake up the girls. I was in the shower, and my wife was in the closet organising it. She comes into the shower and asks if I went outside. I say no. She tells me that our bedroom door is open, and she was sure it was shut before she went into the closet. Explanation: the door swings open if not completely shut. Maybe she didn't get it latched. I was in the basement putting some stuff away. I grabbed water out of my mini fridge, and when I did, I heard the sound of cardboard sliding. It sounded like it came from the other side of the basement. Explanation: none. Almost shit myself and booked it out of there. My wife was looking at things on one of the shelves we have yet to start to go through. I remember her finding a bag of those green plastic army men and the little cowboys and Indian toys. Later, while sitting at my table working on RC cars, I saw something fall out of the corner of my eye. It was that shelf area. A bag with who knows what inside of it fell. I picked it up and stuffed it into a box. Me and the wife were in the basement. She was painting canvases, and I was wrenching on RC cars. Out of nowhere, some metal wire shelves that were leaning up against the wall went bang and rang out. The wife yelled at me and asked what I was doing. I was like 10 feet away from the shelves, sitting in a chair with my back to the shelves. I went and looked at the shelves. Something fell and hit them. I'm not sure what, as the basement is a total mess right now, and I don't know what was there. After the wife got done painting, she sat at the table across from me and read. We both heard a cardboard box slide from the opposite side of the room from the shelves. I then said loudly, "Could you please quit moving stuff?" A possible guardian angel that my very close friend had not so long ago, but still before COVID. He's a Catholic priest who's very open minded and not stuck to beliefs like appearances of angel like creatures, or some voices which are supposed to be gods. But let's continue. He was on a pilgrimage with one of his friends from the priory. They had a mission to go through the entire country on foot and with limited money, so they could only afford food and sleep in people's houses. One day, they stopped in a small village to buy some food. They went into the grocery store and started to choose cans. But right before paying, it turned out that my friend doesn't have enough money. Suddenly, a tall man with long hair and a leather jacket came into the store. When my friend was selecting what to buy, the stranger told the cashier, "This man takes everything, I will pay," and handed him a bill with twice the amount needed for all the groceries chosen by the friend earlier. As my friend described it to me, when the man came to the store, the friend sensed from the stranger some kind of aura or very positive energy that gave hope and some kind of happiness. The man stayed by my friend until he almost finished packing, and during this, he bought something small, water if I remember correctly, then left the store. My friend saw him leaving and wanted to thank him for all the money, but when he opened the door, there was no one there. Not a single living soul, nor a car for about 200 meters in each direction. There were also no cars in front of the store when priests came there. It looked like he just vanished. It was so surreal and amazing that my friend simply started thinking he was probably an angel who helped them during their journey. What do you guys think? What kind of being, or if not a human, could it be? During COVID, the preschool where I worked stayed open, but it was a small place with only 2 classrooms, and a lot of kids didn't come at that time. It ended up being me and one kid a lot of the days. So one evening, we're sitting on the floor playing, and I say something to her with the doll I have or whatever, and the kid doesn't answer. I look up at her, and she's not looking at me, or at the dolls at all. She's looking over my shoulder, just blank-faced. My first instinct was to just say, "H, her name." She didn't respond right away. There was a little spot of silence, but when she did, she looked me in the eye and said, "Your mommy is hugging you right now and wants to tell you that she misses you." My first thought upon hearing that was to check on my mom because I was terrified. So I texted her asking if she was okay. I got a response right away and so I was like, "Okay, whatever," and tried not to think about it again. We keep playing and a few minutes pass and then the kid stops and says, "Miss Y, what does your mommy look like?" I reminded her that she's seen my mom before when she picked me up one day because my car wasn't working. She goes, "Oh, I have seen your mommy. That wasn't your mommy then." I asked her who it was. She said she didn't know. I really didn't want to ask anymore because sometimes I worry that the kids will tell their parents our conversations. And then the parents will think I'm a crazy ghost enthusiast who's teaching their kids scary shit. Also, this kid never said anything like this before or after. It was super random for her. So lately, my wife and I have been going through a hard time with COVID and whatnot. I've been very stressed, and my wife and I have noticed a couple of strange things happening around our apartment. These include phantom spells, cold spots, and objects moving without us remembering moving them. Now some backstory. My dad passed away in 2007 from cancer. We were always very close, and I had to relearn how to live without his guidance and friendship. I keep a small vial of his ashes, along with a photo of him, so that he'll always be near me. This is placed on a shelf in my living room, along with some family photos. My apartment is right next to a large power substation, and we've always had an inkling that there might be a lot of paranormal energy around. Now, since I've been going through this stressful time, I've really been feeling like he's been around. I keep smelling his cologne, a scent he always wore and wore the same scent throughout my life. I associate it with him. It comes and goes, mainly when I'm feeling really down. Other things are some things that were his that I inherited that get moved on occasion. Do you think that it's my dad or something malevolent? I was thinking of getting a spirit box to see if I can make contact. We tried to do EVP, but it's too noisy in our apartment to get a decent sound escape. Is there any danger in using a spirit box? I'm not going to use a Ouija board. Those things scare the crap out of me, so that's out. It would mean a lot to me if it was my dad, knowing that he's keeping an eye out for me. My father passed away in December. He died of COVID-19, but kept the illness from us. When we checked up on him, he was gone in a couple of days. It's devastated us, his children. My brother and I are looking at his affairs while it's being sorted in probate. He left a lot of things unfinished. This morning, I got out of work at 4 a.m, but because there was a citywide parking ban and he owns a tenant building, I decided to just go and do the needed cleanup. There are many times that I've had an unsettling feeling while in his apartment, attic or basement. I tried to keep my mind on the work at hand or on other things in my life while doing cleaning up at his house. Most of the time it works. I go in and hours later, nothing. No vibe. Business as usual. Today, it was not. His apartment gave me instant vibes. The attic as well. Big time in the attic. So much I narrowed my vision to not look into dark corners. The basement was quiet. No vibes. When my brother showed up to help, we got to reminiscing about our father. He took it hard and he cried a bit. After comforting him, we finished up. I asked him to instead go to his apartment and attic and make sure all was secure, given my vibes earlier. I decided to go to the basement where I assumed all was quiet and clear and put all the tools back. Going down the steps, it was thick with what felt like apprehension. Like someone was there watching. Huge vibes. I narrowed my vision, finished, and got out quickly. I went out to my father's garage to also secure the doors. Nothing. No vibes there. After waiting for my brother to show up so he could leave at the same time, he came out and was unnerved. I asked what happened, and he told me he was just in the basement getting something he had forgotten. He told me he heard someone calling out his name twice from the shadows. Thinking I was pranking him, he said to cut it out, but soon realised he was alone. He couldn't get out quick enough. My brother is the sensitive part of the family. He sees a lot and hears more than the rest of us, and doesn't let us in on what he really sees, I feel. I only get the vibes when something is around sometimes. I'm very superstitious, and I believe that my father is lingering about this building. I'm trying to get a priest to come by to bless his apartment and other areas when I go on vacation soon. My grandpa passed away 10 years ago from complications with COVID and pneumonia. He was 67 and very healthy, and we were extremely close. Now, most of these strange coincidences, take them as you want, but personally, I feel they're from him. I'm going to go in order. The night he passed, I was obviously very devastated. Me and my boyfriend were laying in bed and had a candle lit next to us on the end table. And every time I said pappy in a sentence, as that's how I referred to him, I thought the flame on the candle was moving, and so I mentioned it to my boyfriend, and we both looked over, and the flame was completely still. I said, "Pappy?" and the flame started wiggling like crazy. We tested after and tried to blow in the direction from where we were laying, shook the bed, and nothing was moving that flame. So that was interesting. This has happened 2 more times since.
My grandma told me that when red cardinals are here, angels are near. And for reference, I've lived in the apartment I live in since November, and I've never seen a red cardinal outside, and now I've seen them like crazy. I've also frequently looked out the windows while I listen to music and talk on the phone, which is a lot. One day, I was just seeing a ton of red birds, and I told my boyfriend I think they're from my grandpa, and he was debating with me if it was. Well, my grandpa was big into motorcycles, and I've never heard a motorcycle in this apartment complex before. And as we were debating, we heard a motorcycle pull in one of the streets right outside our balcony, where I was seeing the birds. Another weird coincidence. This one is just but almost every time I'm crying and talking about him, I look at the clock and it's like 5:55 or 12:12, like a sequence of numbers, and I think it's just weird.
3 months ago, I saw a black figure hiding around the corner. As I ran after it, it seemed to get further and further away. After going to security and seeing nothing was there, I figured maybe it was something in my head. About a month after I saw this figure, I started getting weird gut feelings. It's almost hard to describe, but it's kind of like a sick to your stomach feeling at the worst, and others, it feels like something is off. Like the feeling you forgot your phone when you're leaving home and don't realize it yet. What I realized over time, though, was when I got those feelings from my friends, family, and most recently, even I was in danger or was in a dark spot. The first account out of the many I have had with a friend was he was in a dark spot. I got that uneasy feeling in my gut, and I had the urge to message him and ask if he was okay. That was when he was told me he was going through some dark stuff and wasn't sure who to talk to or where to go. He said if not for me messaging him, he might have done something bad. The most recent one that happened to was to me. A few days before I went out to my friend's place, a whole 3-hour drive away. My stomach was in the worst twist possible throughout that Monday night. I kept seeing the black figure around my area and was always watching me from afar. Everything went fine going up. Usual traffic being hectic in the big cities with all the riots. Everything went fine, no riots that night, no fights. But the next day, it started raining hard. Long story short, I hydroplaned off the freeway. Luckily everything was fine and I walked off with a messed up shoulder and headaches. My mother was very sick for several years before she passed. She contracted mononucleosis at 50, and when this is contracted as an adult, it can cause a complication of organ failure. She needed a liver transplant and was also having issues with low kidney function due to the illness. She had been in the hospital this entire month before she passed. She seemed like she was getting better, well enough to survive a transplant. She was transferred to the hospital to get her ready for the transplant, but contracted COVID and took a turn for the worst. Now for the premonition part. She had been transferred to a hospital that was a 2.5-hour drive, so I could no longer visit her every day like I had been. I was planning on visiting her the following Saturday, but on the Wednesday before, I just had a feeling that I had to take the next day off to go see her, because she might not make it until Saturday. I sent a message to my boss and put in a request for the next day, Thursday, off. That same night around midnight, I got a call from my stepdad. He spoke with the hospital. They didn't think she would make it. Her lungs were failing and they had to be put her on an ventilator. There was also a blood clot that cut off the blood to her colon and intestines. We had to get there. I called my brother, we drove there, and got there around 2 or 3 a.m. She couldn't open her eyes or speak, but could nod her head yes and no. She could still hear us. We got to say goodbye and how much we loved her before she lost consciousness. She passed that Friday afternoon. She didn't make it to Saturday. The second part is more like what I would consider a real premonition, not just a bad feeling. This is from my brother. He said I could share it. He had a dream that we were all at our grandma's house. There was a bunch of brush at the end of their driveway. It's not in real life. And there was a deer out there. My grandpa, who just passed a little over a year prior, gave my brother a chainsaw to clear the brush and told him to take care of the deer. We all had to agree at the hospital to have them turn the machines off. Her intestines were deteriorating. She needed surgery, but she would never survive. She couldn't get the surgery as she couldn't live if she didn't get the surgery. We were able to ask my mother multiple times beforehand if she wanted everything off, and she vehemently nodded her head yes. And it was in her living that she didn't want a ventilator. Right after the funeral, we went to my grandma's house. At the end of the driveway was a doe. I walked out, got just 10 feet from it, and got a few pictures. It wasn't afraid of me, and when I looked at it, I felt like my mom was checking on us. Back during the very beginning of the pandemic, around March of 2020, my entire household caught COVID. My sister had very mild symptoms. Loss of smell and taste was literally the worst thing she had. I was hit a little harder and was laid out for about a week. My dad, an elderly diabetic man, however, was hit pretty badly. We tried to keep an eye on him as best we could, constantly asking if he wanted to go to the emergency room. His cough was so bad at times he couldn't breathe, but he always refused, saying he didn't think it was that bad yet. I found out later that he would often wake up early during those days, unable to breathe, and that was when he felt maybe it was time to seek help. But when he would find us still asleep, he didn't want to burden us and would just go back to his room. We were still recovering from our own bouts with COVID, but were well enough to watch over him, but he felt we were exhausting ourselves doing that instead of resting. The incident in question happened around the middle of the 3rd week. I was starting to feel well enough that I could sit up and play games for a while without getting nauseatingly dizzy or my body or lungs aching. My dad had started off with symptoms similar to mine, but by this point, his cough had worsened to where he had trouble breathing and he had lost a lot of weight. Every day, we asked how he was doing and he claimed to be fine, in between fits of intense coughing. His constant refusal to go to the hospital kinda had my sister and I resigning to the possibility that one day we'd wake up to discover our father had passed away in his sleep. So I was in my room playing one evening when all of a sudden, my power went out. My TV and console turned off, but not my lights. Assuming my sister had unplugged my power, my room was makeshift and there were no outlets, so I ran a power cord from her room to mine. I asked her if she had unplugged my power. She claimed not to have. When I left my room to inspect the cable, I heard my TV on. Confused, I entered and sat down to resume playing, and just after the game finished loading, it turned off again. I got up to make sure the cables were properly connected, but found them fine. So I disconnected and reconnected them and returned to my room. For some reason, as I was walking to my room, I got the sudden urge to check on my dad. He had gone to his room early to lay down after eating a bit. Unfortunately, I was in gamer mood and just wanted to get back to playing, so I ignored the feeling. The TV turned on, and as soon as I sat down, it turned off. At this point, I was getting aggravated, and as I left the place to replace the cables, my TV, once again, turned on, as soon as I stepped foot outside my room. I turned to enter, and it turned off. I left, and it turned on. I called my sister over, and she was as confused as I was. I probably left and entered at least 10 times with the power coming and going. From the start to this point, couldn't have been more than 7 minutes. The entire time, my feeling to check on my dad kept getting stronger, until I decided maybe something was trying to tell me to go check on him. I approached his room, and since everything was off, including his TV, I assumed he was sleeping. Only, my father snores very loudly when he sleeps, and I didn't hear him. I entered, and he was laying on his bed. I called out to him, but got no response. Unusual, because my father has always been a light sleeper. I called him again, and still no response. My stomach was getting ready to drop when I called him a 3rd time, and I heard him take a deep breath in, and he turned to look at me. He asked me what I needed, and I said nothing, just checking if he was okay. He said yes,
and I went back to my room. I entered and turned the TV and my console on. They stayed on for a few minutes when all of a sudden, tears started rolling down my cheeks. I don't know why, but all of a sudden I was overwhelmed with a sense of, I don't know, relief. But the emotion didn't seem like it was solely my own. I was glad I listened to my instinct to check on my dad, because I got the feeling that we could have lost him that night, but I couldn't understand why it overwhelmed me so much. I never told my father about this, but I did speak to my older sister who lives away from us with her husband and their 7 kids. And she said that our dad told her that when he was at his worst from the virus, he had a dream that his father came to see him. My grandfather died before I was born, but all of my father's family has always said I remind them of him. Anyways, my dad said they spoke for a bit, and when he woke up, I was calling him. My sister says our dad believes his father came to take him. She didn't put much stock in his story then, but after telling her my story might have affected her or something, because since then, she's made much more of an effort to invite our father over to her house to spend time with his grandkids. I suppose the reason I've never told my dad is for fear that he might read too much into it. He's a very devout Catholic, and treat me differently. I already get a lot of grief from my sisters who feel my parents favour me as the youngest and only boy. And I don't want him to start acting like my mom thinks I'm, blessed or something, because of something that apparently happened when I was much younger. My mother's family claims to be sensitive to this kind of stuff, and sometimes it's hard to argue with them, but I've never really believed in the supernatural. It's been almost 2 years, however, and I still think back to this night.
We ended up staying in a Marriott suite in New Hampshire for a 2-month stay, at the beginning stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. My wife, newborn, and I, everything was going as normal. I'm heading to the elevator to go outside and have a smoke. Lobby semi-full. The bar is closed, but you can buy your bottles and take them up. Now, I was all alone in my room, expecting my wife, sister-in-law, and my 3 nephews. I turned on my PS4 to run a little Rainbow Six when I heard children's voices laughing, giggling, and sounded like they're running from the elevator towards my end of the hallway. I get up from the chair and go to unlock the door. To my surprise, there's no one in the hallway. I walk towards the corner elevator and no one is on site. I was like, what the fuck? Am I hearing things? 2 days after, we're heading back to the hotel from an outing, and the wife is downstairs chatting with front desk manager, which is a long-time friend of ours. I put my doggy bag in the microwave and started to hear a flock of kids running and laughing, giggling, chatting away. I look through the peephole and see no one in sight yet again. I call downstairs and ask the manager, Nisha, that I keep moment hearing kids running up and down the hallway. She said we're the only ones booked on the 3rd floor, and the 3rd floor security, and don't see anyone on the cameras either. I was like, well, I heard them right outside my door. Now this was going on just about every day, to every other day, and like a clown, I open the door and still see no one. One night I'm all alone, my wife was out with the girls, and this time, I swear I heard a kid's voice in my bathroom, and I go to check, no one in there. I'm watching TV. I think it was the Travel Channel and a paranormal show was on at the moment, and it was displaying a cigar company that had child labour going on in the 1800s. And at one point, there was a fire accident that burned the cigar warehouse down, and there was over 80 deaths. Many were women and children. And when they exposed the building and whereabouts, it was the very building where we were staying. It was bought out not too long ago of our stay and renovated by Marriott Suites. I immediately got goosebumps and looked at the door. I opened it up and stared down the hallways looking for signs. I even Googled it up and found out that it was factual. Now, I wasn't scared, I was all excited. My wife was a different story. She was nervous and scared. I think we heard them and felt them more due to our child in the room. My wife, though, had me pack my things up, talking about, let's head back home.
There are times where I'll be driving along and suddenly change my route, only to find the exact time I've been going through a specific intersection, there'd be a crash, often deadly. This has happened so many times I've lost count. I was attending a New Year's Eve party with a large group of people, approximately 10 years ago, pre-COVID, when some drunk jock I didn't know showed up and instigated adult activities so he could listen and watch, which irked everyone. So they all chased him out. They then worried that he'd kill someone. He was that drunk. So I mediated for a moment, turned to my closest friend at the time and told him straight-faced, "Don't worry, it's all taken care of." Only to get a call from dude's girlfriend, blaming us for dude's arrest at the end of the driveway for drunk driving. I woke up before my alarm for almost 3 hours on 9/11. Had a sense of dread, knew it was going to be a bad day, and couldn't shake the feeling. I arrived at school seconds after the first tower was attacked and watched the second tower get hit, live. I knew the day my grandmother was going to pass away. 3 days beforehand, and was desperately trying to get to the nursing home she was in. I visited daily, for one final visit to say goodbye before she passed. I knew the moment she passed, approximately 15 minutes prior to the notification phone call. I inexplicably knew we'd end up with our favourite Cheeto in chief the second he announced that he was running for president, and that these last 4 years would be rife with death, destruction, and a depressing repeat of history. My insomnia kicks up before nearly every major disaster. This past Sunday, 31st of May 2020, was no different. I took my older son to get an early birthday present, a new rib for his bicycle. It was close to 4:15 p.m. when I had the same dread from 9/11 wash over me and was dying to get out of the area. We finally left just before our mayor initiated an emergency curfew for our downtown area because of the riots. I averaged maybe 3 hours of sleep a night for 2 days prior, feeling the dread creeping up. Tonight, as I type this dread is only getting worse instead of better. I'm not sure what fresh hell will greet us over the next few days, but it's only getting worse. Anyone else out there have this problem too? I can only sense horrible things to come, and it's incredibly frustrating.
So I'm a fresh nurse, just finished with school and hospital experience, and waiting to graduate. However, where I live, we're in a high demand of nurses, so you're allowed to work once you pass school. Anyway, I've been working at this clinic for a couple months now. It's a private clinic, so the interior basically looks like a house. It has a pharmacy, the doctor's office, and 2 other offices down the hall, a waiting room and a back room. So this starts about 2 weeks ago. I was called in to work a full day, meaning 7 a.m. to 8 p.m, because my other co-workers were tested positive for COVID. So I came in as usually, brought in my coffee, and sat down waiting for people to walk in. We didn't have any appointments that day, so I was just chilling. Then I heard scuffling in the back. At first, I thought it was the ceiling fan since it creaks from time to time, but the more I ignored it, the louder the sound got. I got annoyed and walked to the back, thinking maybe the dog got in. The doctor's house is attached to the clinic. But as I walked to the back, I got a feeling of dread, as if I continued walking something bad would happen. I stopped halfway down the hallway. I decided to let whatever was back there stay there. Now, I didn't think it was paranormal or anything. It was the last thing to cross my mind, actually. But then, it was around 6 p.m. on the same day. I was attending to a client, ringing up her medicine, when the box of aspirin at the top of the shelf just fell. It startled both of us, but again, I didn't think anything of it. I placed it back on the shelf the client left, and I sat back down, waiting for closing time. When closing time came, I remember I had left my purse and sweater in one of the offices without thinking much. I went to the back to gather my stuff. As I gathered everything, I heard the door open and the chime went off, so I stepped out and called from the hallway, "Sorry, we're closed." There was no response. I walked out to check, but there was no one there, not a soul. I locked up the clinic and left for the night. The next day I came in and we were pretty busy with clients, so the events of yesterday didn't cross my mind. At 5 p.m, the doctor called it a day and left to go home. So I was all alone once again. I was on my phone scrolling on Instagram when the lights turned off. I thought about a great power outage, but as I looked up, I saw the lights in the waiting room were still on. I looked next to me where the switch was, and it was off. That's when I got a little freaked out, but I switched it back in and continued scrolling on my phone. I got up to use the bathroom and left my phone on the counter. When I came back, it wasn't there. I thought maybe I did take it with me, so I went back to the bathroom, but it wasn't there. I looked in the hallway where I'd walked to see maybe if it fell. No, there was nothing there. I remember thinking, am I really going nuts here? When I came back to the front, my phone was on the shelf, next to the bottle of aspirin. Loss of words, but stuff like that kept happening every day, until recently. My co-workers just got retested again, and one of them still has COVID, but the other one doesn't, so that means she comes in, and I get a few days off. On the day before I left for my day off about 2 days ago, I was once again sitting at the front counter reading a book this time. When I heard footsteps, wet footsteps coming from the back room, I thought enough was enough. I really thought someone was messing with me. I switched on the light to the back and peered in the room. No one was in there. I shook my head and turned to walk down the hallway, but I stopped. Down the hall were visible, wet footprints. It was as if someone was following me. I closed up early, took my crap and went home. I got back in tomorrow and I'm convinced there's something haunting my workplace. These are just some of my experiences. I have many more from when I was in the hospital.
Okay, so this is going to sound super crazy, but I'm honestly kind of freaking out, so I have to vent somewhere, and I'd like to know what other people think might be happening. So I'm hiding here in my attic at midnight, typing this shit out. Anyways, I don't really know where to begin, or how to describe what has been happening. But I live in this small town. We're about 25 minutes away from cities going north, west, and south, and a mountain to the east. Since COVID, me and my roommates have taken to going on drives through the woods that surround our town. So we all know these roads extremely well, and drive them constantly. And now several times while driving at night through a particular area, we have strange things happen to us that we have absolutely no way to explain. As of tonight, we have decided to start trying to decide these incidents, to try and find some explanation, but nothing makes sense. About a week ago was when the first large incident occurred. We were driving our usual route. We were driving through the woods, and suddenly, on the side of this road, there was this huge creature, about the size of an elk, with fur that looked bearish, but it moved almost like a car, and was skinny and long, and scared the shit out of us. We sped down the road to try to outdistance between us and it, even though it seemed to largely ignore our car. The speed on this particular road is 25. So at this point we were largely scared, so we decided we would probably just head home. We had to be back home at about 10 to go to sleep for work in the morning, and it was only 7:03. But we were running low on gas and we were closer to one of the larger cities than to our town. So we decided to head toward there because from where we were, it should be about just a 10-minute drive. We were driving for about 3 minutes when suddenly we all just felt wrong. Something was off, but no one could tell what. And we continued on to the gas station, arriving at what should have been about 20 past 7. But as we're getting gas, we check our phones and somehow it was now 9:47. And absolutely no one could account for the time. And there was no way the gas beard could have possibly driven for 2 hours. And we needed to be home. But I don't like the speed, especially at night, so we decided we would just be home late. We called our other roommates and let them know we were running late, and they gave us shit for being out for so long. But that's beside the point. So we head back toward our town, which would be expected to take about 25 minutes, like I said before. And that's about what the drive felt like. About 15 minutes into the drive back on the side of the road again, there's a huge creature, this time standing up on its hind legs, at least 10 feet tall. And I just fucking swerve around it and then speed like hell towards home. This is now on a separate road. So we then pull up to our house and head in, and our roommate freaks out and asks us if we got gas here in town. And we were like, no, the city, like we said. And he was staring at us weird. And we looked at the clock and it was 9:53. And we were inside our house. It made no sense. First, we lost 2 hours. And now we make a 25-minute drive in 5 minutes with my slow-ass driving. In my shitty car that can't go over 50. We couldn't explain it. We went over everything from a time anomaly to alien abduction to witchcraft. We were just at a complete loss. So we avoided going on drives for a bit because we were just worried about what the absolute hell was going on. But we eventually broke down and went into the woods again. Tonight. And I'm honest, I'm terrified to my wit's end. I can't sleep. Nothing fucking out of the ordinary, just driving. Sorry. But we were passing familiar fences. About 2 minutes from our town, and then suddenly, I start having a horrible headache. And my roommate who was talking just stood. Everything got fuzzy, and we both closed our eyes, and suddenly the road was wrong. I had no idea where I was. I swerved in a panic, but regained myself and kept driving. We were both dumbfounded. She asked me where we were and I had no answer. Then after about 30 seconds, a familiar street sign came by. We were suddenly entering a city we had just been nowhere near. We had travelled over 50 miles in the blink of an eye. I literally cried. I have no idea how it happened. We immediately turned on the road home and I refused to blink most of the way. And when I did, I made sure she was keeping her eyes open and on the road. We got home and I was literally in the attic. And here I am, posting this. Please, someone believe me and explain this. I'm terrified. I haven't had much time for leisure with work recently. Been having to accept some pretty awful shifts to get by with COVID times. So I've lost my ability to go on my evening walks, which were a method of stress relief for me. It had been a while since I'd gone on one, so 3 nights ago, I decided to just go for a late night walk. I put on my headband flashlight and decided to take a path I hadn't in ages. There's a small trail near the back of my neighbourhood that goes about 4 miles deep into the woods. My plan was to walk about 1.5 miles in and take the parallel path to come back. I make it down to around 1.3 miles, according to my Fitbit, and I start getting that feeling I'm being watched. I turn off my headlight and sit still to listen. At this point, I'm more concerned there's a guy following me who's up to no good. I heard clear footsteps in the leaves off the trail, and they've been behind me for nearly 5 minutes. I stopped thinking it was an animal or another walker and became worried. Sitting there for probably 3 to 4 minutes and I hear nothing at all, I turn back on my headlight and decide to start walking quickly back home. About 2 minutes later, I hear footsteps again. This time it sounds different. It sounds like 4 feet instead of 2 feet walking, and it's walking at the same increased speed I am. I turn around quickly with my headlights and my phone light and point it behind me. Silence. I get angry and yell out, "Leave me alone! I'm going to call the cops. And if you come at me, I have a knife." Silence. I yell again to get the fuck out of here and start walking towards where I heard the walking. About 20 yards out, hard to fully make out because the flashlight doesn't reach too far, I see what looks like a literal naked man running full speed on all 4s into the woods. Normally I'd chalk that up to drugs, but my area does not have a drug problem. And there were some details that led me to believe it wasn't a person. For one, they were damn near hairless, completely bald, pale white skin, and the way it ran on 4s looked natural. Not like when you try to run on all 4s and look stupid. It looked like its bone structure was designed to walk on all 4s. There was no hunched look, their back was flat and they were fast. Last thing that happened was straight out of a horror movie. I hadn't heard anything in a while on my way back, but kept turning around to be sure. With about 0.3 miles left to go until I was in the clear, I heard a mad dash through the leaves. I whip around and it stops on a dime. I see the edges of its head behind a tree and yell loudly to try and intimidate. What I heard next, I'll never forget in my entire life. It cackled like a monkey, a noise I've literally only heard in nature documentaries. The tone was that of a mockery, a predator having fun with me. I didn't stick around. I sprinted as fast as possible back home. I'd love to believe this was some prank, or some rabid, bored, diseased coyote, but I got a pretty clear look at it. It wasn't. It had human feet and human hands, a human head and a human buttocks, but nothing else about it was human. I called the cops after and told them that the man was following me. I didn't want to say some creature because they'd think I'm crazy. They didn't find anything, but they did see quite a bit of activity in the leaves and dirt, about 50 feet from where the trail was, leading far back into the woods before it got to a large stretch of grass, where no footprints were seen. There was an incident while I was at work a few months ago. I worked in the airlines. A passenger handed me their tickets and I looked up at them and they smiled. While they smiled, a voice said, "The marriage is fake." There was a woman behind him and I asked, "Oh, is this your wife?" He replied, "Yes, we are going on our honeymoon." A voice then said, "Stop him." I made small talk and a minute or two later, 3 police officers showed up. I heard over the radio they said a name. I looked at the tickets and on the tickets was the name they needed. I asked the man to step aside with his wife for a moment. I spoke with the police officers and later found out he was a felon who faked his marriage. There was another incident while I was at work back around the end of November to the beginning of December. There was a passenger who in some way managed to bring 7 backpacks with him. As I checked his ticket number, he hadn't paid for the extra bags. My manager went up to him and let him know he had to pay for the extra bags. Each bag would cost an additional $130, with the extra weight and fee within the charge. At first he tried to gain sympathy by saying he was studying to become a doctor. He later changed his story and said he worked and studied in a lab, and that within the bags were his book and some lab equipment. As he repacked his bags, for security reasons I had to watch him do this. Before he opened them, he looked up at me, paused, and then opened his bags while keeping eye contact with me. Each bag was full of peanuts. Opened containers of peanuts with no seal, which meant they were open prior to boarding. I spoke with management about this, yet for some reason they really wanted this man on board. I went back and he repacked his bags. He said he was able to pay for 5 of them, but not the 6th. He repacked enough where he didn't need the 7th bag. I returned to management to discuss it, and as we spoke, he attempted to give his bags to the other passengers, not allowed in any airport, immediate deboarding and delay of the flight, as well as a fine and near felony charges. I returned to the passenger and reminded him not to do this. I returned his bags to him via the security footage. I asked him for his passport, and when I held it in my hands, I saw a vial, a shot, a virus, lungs, the world map and hospital beds. I heard the sound of coughing. When it was done, I noticed I was looking into his eyes and he said in a frantic whisper, "Help me." His eyes wide and his voice shook. I went back to management ready to call security and they didn't allow me to. For whatever reason, I hadn't seen them, so inclined to make sure someone was on the plane. They boarded the passenger. That was back in November to possibly the very beginning of December. Afterwards, our entire crew, except for about 2 people, became seriously ill. Afterwards, myself and the team had been moved to other airlines as the news of COVID affected many airlines, until eventually they had been postponed in the area until further notice. As I was working in the other airline, I was checking in a passenger and asking the usual questions with the usual small talk. They later told me they were afraid the flight was going to be delayed. I asked, "Oh, I am sorry. Was it because of the volcano?" They looked at me and said, "No, it's just because sometimes flights are delayed."
I said, "The volcano on the island?" We laughed and I handed them the tickets. I later turned to my coworker and asked, "Wasn't there news of a volcano eruption?" He turned to me and said, "No, not that I've heard of." We checked the news and I looked up the island and yet no news came out. I could have sworn it happened. I knew the name, the island, and yet the news hadn't come out or it didn't happen yet. A few days later, one of our flights had been delayed because of a volcanic eruption on a nearby island. The same island I had typed in the search and remembered. I'd seen in the news when truly it hadn't even happened at that time. There was a passenger who seemed very anxious due to the events of COVID at the time. I tried to comfort him as he was elderly and was planning to go on a cruise ship, and he was excited about it, but also slightly nervous because his daughter tried to beg him not to go on the ship. He pulled out his phone and showed me the ship. A voice said, "A stranded ship." I took a breath and told him about some good hotels in the city he was flying to, and also nearby cities and beach towns. He was thankful. Again, about a week later, news came in that the ship had in fact become stranded due to COVID-19 complications within. I hope he took up the hotel options, but I couldn't push it because of my job duties. There was another incident, which was of the last. On the last flight we had, I was called as well as the entire team. While we were there checking tickets and enforcing social distancing, I cannot explain it well to those who had not had it happen. As I walked to the gate and through the passengers to check tickets and to ask if they had any questions, I was shown through my eyes a number of them were sick without symptoms yet. No one knew at the time, but for some reason I was shown this. I was also shown my coworker would become sick. I had asked and was given permission to return home. I had gone home 40 minutes early that day as the large number of us had not been needed for that flight. News came out that those two passengers I was shown in real-time vision were removed from the flight when they didn't pass the third phase of protocol. News also came out that the co-worker had fallen ill a little while after the flight. She was one of my co-workers who previously hadn't fallen ill in November or December. I worked in a detention facility that I will call the Upstate, for the sake that although I do not currently work there anymore, I still have friends there. We had a particular pod that was overflow for solitary confinement, 23-hour lockdown with 1 hour of free time. This unit was fairly dark, quite aside from the occasional inmates screaming expletives at the detention officers as they walked by every 30 minutes or so, conducting a security tour. I feel it's important to describe the pod setup, as it is unique to the other 3 pods on that floor. The pod was set up to hold 80 inmates, with partition walls separating every 20 rooms or so. The portion of the pod where the inmates were held were 2 floors. The upper floor was more of a mezzanine with a simple guardrail and a single set of stairs leading up to it. There was no cage or fence preventing anyone from jumping over the rail and experiencing a 20-foot drop to suddenly stop onto the concrete floor below. This is important for later. The pod itself was generally rather dark, cold, and mostly dead silent. The atmosphere was pretty depressing, even just for us officers. With that being said, it shouldn't be too surprising that the pod was notorious for suicide attempts and a few successes. When COVID had made its way to the States, we ended up converting the unit to a quarantine unit for violent crimes or crimes against the minor. All of those solitary confinement inmates were either transferred to the Special Housing Units, SHU, pronounced SHU, had their cases re-examined by our in-house judge, or dropped entirely. The COVID pandemic was an interesting time to work in a jail. After the transition took place, all of the violent criminals and gang-affiliated crimes against children inmates would be required to be quarantined in this pod for 2 weeks, before being transferred to another part of the jail to await trial. In August of 2020, roughly 5 p.m, I relieved the day shift officers on the pod. At that time, it was our policy that out of the 20 rooms in the 4 separated sections of the pod, only 4 inmates were to be allowed out of their 1 hour of free time. The inmates could use this time to shower, call out from the phones in the common area, watch TV, or utilize the outside recreation area. I and one other officer from my shift conducted our mandatory guard tour of all 4 sections. We decided that it would be ideal that I take 2 sections and my officer take the other 2 to split the workload. My tour was rather uneventful. However, my partner claimed that on his tour, he overheard an inmate talking to his assumed mother in a rather irate and panicked voice. Neither one of us really thought of anything of it, as he wasn't saying anything to be of concern, but as it came close for that particular group to go back to their rooms, so the next group of 4 inmates could come out, we observed this inmate walk up the stairs and stand in front of his room, facing the officer's station. After about a minute of standing there staring at us officers from the 2nd floor, I keyed the intercom system for that section to inform him that free time was over, and he needed to enter his room, so I could pop out the next group for their free time. After I finished saying what I said, this inmate climbed the guardrail and stood on the topmost rung of the rail, and proceeded to jump headfirst onto the concrete floor below. Me and the officer I was working the pod with bolted into the section where the inmate jumped, notifying both our superiors and the medical staff for a 1089 suicide attempt in the process. When we entered the section, not only did we not see a body, but the room with the open door was completely empty. Both me and the fellow officer I worked with looked at each other in sheer confusion, because we both seen this happen. About 8 minutes housed on the 2nd floor were going wild, screaming that a man jumped. At this time, of the 20 rooms, only 11 were occupied for that section. That makes 10 people who watched a man who looked just as real as anyone I've ever met climb the rail and jump. None of the people on the bottom floor seen anything, but the 8 on the 2nd floor witnessed it. When my lieutenant and the medical staff arrived, both me and the other officer were running around the pod, trying to find where this man went. About 45 minutes of trying to explain to my lieutenant and the medical staff of what we witnessed, and interviewing the 8 inmates who seen it, my lieutenant finally agreed to roll back the cameras for that section. In the video, there was no one at the phones, despite clearly seeing my partner look at the phone, pause, and carry on as if he was looking at someone. The camera only had what appeared to be a very faint orb-like object move from the phones up the stairs, and it disappeared near the opened door. When we rolled the video back further to the day shift, they released 3 inmates and the empty room door opened as well, but no one exited. When we went back and looked at the metal sheet, a sheet we had at the officer station cataloguing the rooms that were occupied, the room was blank. When we investigated further, an inmate accused of raping an 8-year-old boy was housed in that same exact room. This inmate was also known to be frequently use the phones to call his mother and get into heated arguments over money. This inmate committed suicide in the exact same manner over 4 years prior on the day, on that exact time. To this day, it remains the most compelling proof of hauntings to me. I refuse to ever work that post again for the remainder of my time working there, and pretty much everyone who has worked that post has had varying degrees of paranormal activities. Empty rooms having their doors open despite no one actually unlocking the door. Voices, screams, and the showers turning on randomly.
Back on December 8th, I tested positive for COVID-19. I had to quarantine for 10 days. What was odd, that a couple of days later, during the hours of noon and 4 p.m, 2 or 3 people would ring my doorbell or knock on my door. I didn't answer the door. I noticed that they stood far away from the door. This happened at least 3 days in a row. On the 4th day, someone came to the door and started pounding on it. I yelled through the door that I couldn't open the door because I had COVID-19 and couldn't let them in due to having COVID-19. The guy apologizes for pounding on the door and left very quickly. On the 5th day, someone rang my doorbell twice at 2 a.m.
I didn't answer the door and had my phone on in my hand, ready to call 911. I saw a white car parked on the street and saw a man at the door. On the sixth day, I heard 2 knocks on the door, but it didn't sound like a normal knock. When this woke me, I suddenly felt sick and felt like I was having an irregular heartbeat for about 30 seconds. And then I could hear my heart beating, and I felt a sense of terror. I had my phone ready to call 911. Something in my mind told me not to go near the door as I sensed danger. At this point, I felt like I needed to pray in order to get through whatever it was. I felt that whatever was outside was pure evil. I prayed for about half an hour, and then I felt okay. What was weird is that I kept hearing COVID-19 protected you from being physically harmed. I went back to sleep and woke up the next morning refreshed. While I was home for the remainder of quarantine, no one came by. I've heard that 3 knocks on the door in the middle of the night is a bad omen, often a warning of a death of a family member or close friend. 2 knocks I've heard is a warning not of death, but of serious illness or misfortune of family and friends. Another thing I've heard is that it's a warning to the person who heard it of being aware of evil around you. What happened shortly after this was a family member, an older stepsister, became ill and had to be hospitalized overnight. She's okay, but it was a serious health scare. Fast forward to yesterday. I came home yesterday evening and saw the police talking to someone that I didn't know. I went inside, but kept noticing that the police car kept driving around the neighborhood. I finally asked a neighbor, who told me that since December, he's had people coming to his house who appear to be solicitors, but they aren't. He told them he would call the police if they came to his house again, which they didn't. He believed that these individuals might be trying casing and targeting our neighborhood for burglary. They were trying to get into people's homes, and one of them would pound repeatedly on your door. Police were called because of this. I thought about what happened to me last month. The man who police talked to wasn't leaving, but was walking around the neighborhood. I didn't get a good look at him, so I'm not sure if he came to my house last month. I then happened to look through the peephole on my door as I heard what sounded like someone at my front door and saw a man standing there from a distance. I grabbed my phone as I wondered if this guy would try to kick the door down, as he could easily do that from where he was standing. 5 minutes later, he was gone. I assumed he was the same man the police were talking with, but I'm not sure. Interesting enough, the day this happened was the 22nd of January. Notice the number 2. The 2 doorbell rings at 2 a.m. were on the 12th of January. Do you think the doorbell rings and knocks of 2 were a warning of some type? Any feedback would be helpful to me. Update. I found out today that the man who police questioned wasn't the same man that came to my home back in December. Nor was he the guy that came to my door on Friday. The police are aware of what's going on and have added extra patrols. My front porch has a sense of peace, and one thing I noticed is that I haven't seen people that aren't familiar to me walking around the neighborhood. This morning, I felt like the evil presence had left the area. My dad passed away 15 years ago when I was 26. At the time, my now wife, girlfriend and I had been together for 6 years, so she knew my dad well. He was only 52 when he died. It was horrible and tragic. My wife is 9 months pregnant with our first child. We started late and was due to give birth today by C-section. That's been postponed by now, but anyway. Last night, my wife and I were out walking our dog. During these times of COVID, we always cross the street rather than pass someone. But for some reason, when a man started walking towards us, neither of us moved across the street. I stressed this guy looked nothing like my dad. As he approached, we had this exchange. Man, that's a handsome dog. What's his name? Me. Stanley. He loves it when people make a fuss of him. The man then crouched and made a fuss of the dog, which he loved. Man, he's a good boy, locks eyes with me. So were you. Me.
Cheers. Man. Anyway, I've got to go. He nods towards my wife's very pregnant belly. Just wanted to let you know, everything's going to be fine. Be lucky. He then walked away singing Always Look on the Bright Side of Life from the life of Brian. 2 things. Be lucky is something my dad used to say very often, and it's how he would end every phone call. It's a common expression in the part of London my dad was from. We now live in Manchester. I haven't heard anyone say it since leaving London. It's not a common expression here, and the man had a local accent. I think the last person I heard say that was my dad. Secondly, The Life of Brian was my dad's favourite film, and we played that song at the end of his funeral. As we walked away, my wife said, "Well, that's weird." I started saying something like, "Coincidences can be really funny sometimes." My wife stopped me and said, "Just take it, babe. Don't try to explain it." We haven't spoken about it since, though I still feel very emotional thinking about it.